Racist cop hits and knocks down an elderly black man in a park, but didn't know someone was watching. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing news stories here. James, a man of 74, walked slowly between the old trees that seemed to protect the place. His footsteps made a soft noise. His cane tapped the ground, and each sound was like a song. With his body slightly bent by the passage of time, he didn't walk out of haste or necessity. He walked because he really wanted to feel life around him. He wanted to reconnect with the simplicity of nature. His face, with deep wrinkles that showed the stories of a long life full of challenges, showed a mixture of calm and sadness. James didn't say much, but his head held many memories. He remembered moments that he liked to think about again, especially when he was alone and at peace. He looked closely at the birds flying from one tree to another. He liked to see how their wings moved. It was as if each flight showed the freedom he wanted in the last years of his life. From afar, the sound of the voices of some girls chatting happily barely reached his ears. He didn't look at them. For James, what really caught his attention was the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the sunlight coming through the branches. The park was his special place. It was a place where he could put aside the sorrows of the past and the difficulties that age had brought. When he came to an old wooden bench, he stopped for a moment. He leaned on his cane and looked sideways. He felt a needle in his chest. It wasn't a real pain, but a longing that he couldn't explain. Perhaps he misses easier times. He remembers times when discrimination didn't affect him so much. Or maybe he misses the youth he knows he'll never get back. James let out a sigh and sat down. He felt the cold wood on his body. He placed his hands on the cane and closed his eyes for a moment. He let the cool wind touch his face. The park had a lot of life around it, but James was lost in his own silence. It was a pleasant silence. He could hear more than just words and noises. He could hear the sounds of the past. They were echoes of a life he was trying to understand and accept. The years passed like fallen leaves on an autumn afternoon. Jeffrey was around 30 years old. However, the hatred and hurt he felt made him seem older. His gaze, which was partially covered by his sunglasses, observed the park with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. He couldn't notice the beauty of the trees or the tranquility of the people there. For him, the park was just another place where trouble could break out at any time. He was always prepared to face it. As he drove slowly along the cobbled road through the park, Jeffrey saw a small group of young people chatting in the distance. Their laughter could be heard faintly in the air. He saw something that caught his attention. It was an elderly man with black skin sitting calmly on a bench. He was holding a cane and had a faraway look in his eyes. For Jeffrey, that ordinary scene gave rise to an anger for no reason, which came from damaged ideas that he had never stopped to think about. "But what is this old man doing here?" said Jeffrey quietly to himself. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. He glanced back at the group of young women who were laughing and chatting nonchalantly, just a few meters away from James. Jeffrey's confused head soon formed a risky story. The gentleman wasn't there for nothing. He must have had some strange motive, something bad that needed to be stopped. Jeffrey suddenly stopped the car. The sound of the brake made a few people look up with interest, but they soon went back to paying attention to their things. For Jeffrey, this was the moment when he needed to do justice. It was a justice that came from the way he saw the world. He got out of the police car with sure steps. The strength of his work as a police officer was visible in every step he took. The way he was positioned seemed threatening, even without saying anything. His shoulders were broad. His uniform was very neat. His hand was close to where he kept his gun. This showed that he was prepared to act, and this action would not be calm. He walked up to James, his gaze locked on the man as if he already knew what was going to happen to him. For Jeffrey, this wasn't just a job. It was a chance to show how he thought things should be in a world that, in his mind, was always about to fall apart. When Jeffrey arrived near the bench where James was sitting, the mood seemed to change. The silence that had once been calm was now filled with tension. James didn't see Jeffrey coming soon. He was thinking about other things. But when Jeffrey came within a few meters, James raised his head. His instinct, which came from years of mistrust, made him realize. Jeffrey stopped very close to James. His eyes showed judgment. His face was serious, with no sign of affection or understanding. "Old man," said Jeffrey in a firm voice, "what are you doing here around these girls?" The question, full of prejudice, hit James like a punch. He blinked, a little confused at first. Then he looked around, trying to understand what was being said about him. The girls were far away, and he hadn't said anything to them. The only thing he had done wrong, it seemed, was to be in that place at the same time as them. "I'm just relaxing," James replied with a calmness that, to Jeffrey, seemed like a challenge. "I look at the trees and the birds. I don't see anything else." But Jeffrey had already created his own idea of what had happened. He squinted behind his sunglasses. He crossed his arms and took a posture that looked more frightening. To him, it wasn't true. It was an excuse that didn't look good. In Jeffrey's mind, a man like James, at that time and in that place, could only be there for bad reasons. He didn't see an older man looking for peace and quiet. He saw a suspicious person, someone who needed to be controlled. "Bullshit," said Jeffrey with contempt. He was almost able to spit the word out. "You're here for other purposes, aren't you? What's an older man like you doing around younger girls? He must be trying to annoy them." The accusation really hurt James. He felt sad and hurt. He was an older man who always treated people with respect. However, what Jeffrey said was a great humiliation. James felt anger rising up inside him. It was an anger that he had learned to keep under control because of many years of discrimination and prejudice. But now that anger was about to come out. His hand gripped the cane tightly as he stood up slowly. He looked straight at Jeffrey, facing the lie. "Respect me," said James, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm not a person who commits crimes. I'm a good person, and you're accusing me of something very bad." Jeffrey, however, didn't give up. For him, saying no was a form of defiance. His prejudice became so strong that he couldn't see the truth, even when it was right in front of him. In James's mind, he was already guilty. He was there to take the law into his own hands. This justice was cruel and wrong. It was done because of his racism and his abuse of power. But Jeffrey, with his eyes half closed and his arms crossed, wasn't in the mood to listen to what James was saying. For him, just having a man like James in that place was reason to be suspicious. His fixed ideas about race and class were so strong that they left no room for reality. The more James tried to defend himself, the more Jeffrey thought something was wrong. "Do you think you can fool me with this nonsense?" Jeffrey said, taking another step forward. By now, his body was almost taking up all of James's space. "People like you, who are older, are always trying to look good. But I know what your real intentions are. You came here to take advantage of these girls, didn't you? Are you going to say you didn't?" The accusation finally took James by surprise. His eyes, which had once been calm, were now filled with an intense glare. He had never been treated with such disrespect in his entire life. Anger grew inside him, and he felt the blood rushing through his body. It was a strong emotion that was about to come out. That accusation was so unfair. "Enough," shouted James, clutching the cane that was shaking in his hand. "I won't accept this lie. Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? I'm an old man, yes, but I'm not a crook. You can't accuse me like that." Jeffrey, however, wasn't surprised by James's outburst. In fact, he saw it as further confirmation that he was right. For him, the old man's anger was not a correct response to a false accusation. It was the reaction of a person who had been caught doing something wrong. "I'll show you a lesson, old man," said Jeffrey, his voice low and frightening. "Let's see if you can keep it up with the police." "Do what you want," said James, looking at Jeffrey without showing any fear. "But know that I have nothing to be ashamed of. I've spent my life with dignity, and it won't be a man like you who will take that away from me." The words, spoken with the certainty of someone who has seen the world many times, hung in the air like a last defense. The people around them spoke quietly, surprised at the way James was being treated. But deep down, everyone understood that the tension was going to increase and could become more violent. James, brave though he was at a disadvantage because of Jeffrey's exaggerated power. Jeffrey, realizing that he could no longer control the situation, wanted to show that he was still in charge. His mind, already full of prejudice and frustration at being challenged in front of others, had closed itself off to any chance of reason or understanding. For him, old James, who was now a symbol of resistance, needed to be dominated, and he would use as much force as he thought the situation called for. "I've heard enough from you," said Jeffrey with a manner that mixed anger and contempt. "Now you'll understand what happens when someone disrespects their superiors." He no longer paid attention to the crowd that was growing around him. He also didn't mind the curious glances of the people passing by. Jeffrey had a strong desire to show that he was in control. He wanted to show his power. even if it meant going beyond the rules of justice. He took a quick step towards James, who, even though he was older, still looked dignified. Before the older man could act or fully understand what was happening, Jeffrey raised one of his hands and pushed him hard in the chest. The effect happened instantly. James, who has fragile bones and no longer balances well because of his age, dropped his cane. His body fell hard onto the hard floor of the park. The noise of the fall was so loud that it sounded like thunder. James fell to the ground with a loud thud. He groaned in pain as he felt the blow to his tired muscles and bones. The cane, which was firmly in his hand, went a long way and rolled a few meters. This left him weaker and without protection. The surprise of the assault was clear on his face. He tried unsuccessfully to understand what had happened. He was a man who had spent his life taking care of his honor and honesty. Now he was lying on the ground, being treated like a thief. The people around stopped for a moment. No one could believe what they had just seen. That way of acting was not what was expected of a policeman. This person was supposed to protect and help, but now he was behaving like an uncontrolled aggressor. The sound, which had once been calm, now turned into a low rumble of fear and anger, as the people watching began to understand the seriousness of what was happening. But fear and doubt meant that no one intervened right away. James, who was still lying on the floor, felt his body ache. The pain in his body was great, but nothing was greater than the sadness he had just felt. Being treated so violently for a small misunderstanding, an accusation so wrong and unfounded, made him feel humiliation like he had never felt before. He had faced many injustices in his life. However, he never thought that, when he was older, he would be seen as a threatening man and it would come to this. Jeffrey, on the other hand, didn't show any regret or doubt. He seemed happy, as if he thought that fight was something he needed to do. He wanted to show that he was strong to anyone who tried to challenge him. He quickly bent down and pulled James up by the arms to pin him to the ground. The policeman's hands were strong and firm as he placed the handcuffs on James's delicate wrists. He tightened the cold metal around the old man's wrinkled skin. "What are you doing?" James managed to say quietly, his voice shaking with pain and fright. He looked at Jeffrey in surprise. He was trying to understand how the situation had come to this. His mind tried to find a logical explanation, but all he saw was Jeffrey's cold, emotionless face. He was now lifting you up with force, as if you were an object and not a person. "You're going to study your lesson at the police station," said Jeffrey, in a way that was so serious that it scared James to death. "Older people like you think they can do what they want, but I'm here to sort things out." James tried to speak, but the words were jumbled in his mouth. The impact and the pain made him weak. The pressure of the handcuffs on his wrists only made his discomfort worse. He realized that the people around him were looking at him. Some were frightened and others didn't know what to do, but no one acted. It was as if the force of Jeffrey's authority had put pressure not only on James, but also on the will of everyone watching. As Jeffrey pushed him closer to the police car, the people who were there began to speak louder. Some people took out their cell phones and filmed what seemed to be a clear violation of their rights. Others just watched and didn't know what to do. The fear of seeing a policeman with a gun and being aggressive made everyone stand still. Meanwhile, James, arrested and ashamed, was taken away as if he were a very dangerous thief. As they walked, James took one last look at the sky, which was still clear and bright. It seemed that the surrounding nature didn't care about the injustice happening down there. He had a feeling of surprise and great sadness. How could this be happening? How could his life, which had seen so many challenges overcome, have been reduced to humiliation in front of other people? Before Jeffrey could push him into the police car, something unexpected happened. A person appeared in the middle of the crowd. He moved with a firm manner and looked straight ahead. It was Kevin, James's son. He was about to change everything in history. Kevin brought a new strength. Not even Jeffrey was ready to deal with it. The situation, which was already full of tension, was about to get even more intense. But at that moment, as Jeffrey prepared to push James into the back of the police car, a different person appeared in the crowd. Kevin, who is James's son, arrived with a light that seemed to change the place where he was standing. His way of behaving, which was tough, sure and strong, showed that he had a clear power. But it wasn't just the way he behaved that made everyone look at him. Kevin was an army lieutenant. He had a strength that didn't need a uniform or a weapon. That strength came from his dignity, courage, and great sense of justice. He arrived at the park to see his father. He didn't know he was going to see such a sad scene. Kevin had seen many things in his life. He had seen fights, losses, and difficult times. But nothing could have prepared him for seeing his father. His father was an older, frail man. Kevin was very sad to see how his father was treated without respect. His blood ran hot at the time, but his head, which he had learned from army discipline, remained calm. The wind seemed to stop. Everyone looked at Kevin, who was walking towards Jeffrey with firm steps. His every gesture showed firmness and strength of will. The people around him, who had only looked on, began to realize that something was about to change. Kevin wasn't just an angry son. He was a person who carried the importance of a greater justice. "Release my father." Kevin's voice rang through the air, calm but full of firmness. He didn't shout. He didn't make a show of it. His words were like a clear order that couldn't be ignored. Jeffrey, even with his great pride and prejudices, hardly looked at Kevin at first. He was concentrating on getting James into the police car. He didn't care about the people around him. To him, that person was just another bystander. They were perhaps a relative he could put aside. Jeffrey put more pressure on James's arm as if to show that he was in charge. "I said, let go of my father," said Kevin, now more forcefully. He walked a few more steps towards the policeman. His eyes were firmly fixed on Jeffrey's, and they didn't move a bit. The park, which had once been filled with the sounds of conversation, was now very quiet. People looked on with hope. They felt that justice was almost ready to be on the right side. This time, Jeffrey looked at Kevin with contempt in his eyes. He saw a younger man. The man had a strong face and a stiff posture. However, he didn't immediately realize that he was dangerous. Jeffrey was so full of anger and prejudice that he didn't notice the strength of the man standing next to him. To him, Kevin was just another person who had no power. He was just another small problem that he could ignore with the same harshness he had shown so far. "Who do you think you are?" asked Jeffrey sarcastically. "You think you can tell me what to do? Stay out of it. It's none of your business." Kevin held back for a moment. His army training had taught him to stay calm in difficult moments. He shouldn't make snap decisions. But the situation he was facing was personal. Seeing his father, a man he had always respected, being treated like a thug for no reason, was something he couldn't bear. Kevin took a deep breath and moved closer to Jeffrey. He was now only a few steps away from him. He spoke slowly, but with a force that could be felt by everyone around him. He said, "You can't treat my father like that. I'm Lieutenant Kevin James from the U.S. Army. I'm asking you to release my father now." The name and the license came down like a punch you can't see. Jeffrey, who didn't know who he was talking to, paused for a moment. The expression Army Lieutenant stuck in his head. The first time he was in doubt. His eyes hesitated as if trying to understand the new information. The people around him spoke quietly, amazed at what they had discovered. Kevin nevertheless stood firm, waiting for the answer. He understood that this was the moment when the situation could change. But he also knew that Jeffrey, with his pride hurt and about to be shamed, would not give up easily. People were questioning Jeffrey's authority in a clear and direct way. The policeman understood that if he accepted this, he would completely lose control of the situation. Jeffrey, trying to show that he was still in charge, smiled sarcastically. "I don't care who you are," he said, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Here, I'm in charge. And you don't say anything here." Kevin knew that words alone weren't enough. With a calmness that surprised, he advanced without warning. In one swift, sure movement, he grabbed Jeffrey with a technique he had learned in military training. The crowd took a deep breath at the sight of his quick action and surprise. Jeffrey was taken aback and had no way to respond. Within seconds, he fell to the ground. He lay still and confused. "You're no longer in control of the situation," said Kevin with a cool, calm manner. He remained strong, but without being rude. For Kevin, it wasn't about aggression, but about doing the right thing. He knew he needed to be strong at that moment, but he didn't want to embarrass Jeffrey like the policeman had done to his father. Kevin took his cell phone out of his pocket and called the police. He told them the situation clearly. He called for help while holding Jeffrey down. James, still trapped, looked on with a sense of pain and pride. His body was bruised, but his heart felt some peace as he realized that his son had taken the lead. When Colonel Matthew arrived, accompanied by other police officers, the park fell silent. He was a man who remained strong and knew how to deal with difficult times. However, he was clearly affected when he saw the mess his officer was in. Matthew walked with a commanding manner, looking at Kevin, at Jeffrey, who was still getting up from the ground, and at Mr. James, who was bruised and embarrassed, but holding his head high next to his son. Kevin, seeing that Matthew was approaching, remained calm. He knew that the colonel could change what was happening, but the colonel was ready to stand his ground. He was a military man, but also a son fighting for his father's honor. Matthew stopped a few steps away from them and watched the scene with a look that was hard to understand. As the head of the police station, he needed to show that he was in charge of the situation. But he also had to ensure that justice was done. The large number of people around was now silent. It seemed that what would happen next was something that could not be changed and was very sensitive. "Kevin James," Matthew said, recognizing the Army lieutenant on the spot. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was concern in it. Kevin was a famous man in the city. He was known for his career in the Army and for commanding respect from people in the community. For Matthew, facing a problem between two important men would be a difficult path to follow. Kevin had no doubt. With the same calmness and precision that characterized him in combat, he walked up to Matthew but stayed at a suitable distance. His voice was strong, but it also showed the seriousness of what was happening. "Colonel, that man," said Kevin, showing Jeffrey, who was standing up trying to recover, "hit my father for no reason. He made him feel smaller, threw him to the ground and put his hands in handcuffs for no reason. All this happened because he made an accusation that wasn't true, just because of prejudice." Kevin's words were direct and easy to understand. However, they had a strong emotion that could not be ignored. He was speaking not just as an Army officer, but as a son who had just seen his father treated cruelly by someone who was supposed to look after people. Matthew closed his eyes a little and his expression became serious. He knew who Jeffrey was. He knew that the policeman had a very explosive temper, but so far there had been nothing to show that he could act in such an extreme way. However, there was no ignoring Kevin's description. He turned to Jeffrey, waiting for him to give an explanation. His posture now showed that he wanted answers. "Jeffrey," said Matthew in a serious voice but without shouting, "is what the lieutenant says true?" Jeffrey, trying to regain his command, was quiet for a while. He felt proud and ashamed at the same time. He understood that if he told everything, his career would almost be over. But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy to say no with so many people watching. People looked on, cell phones recorded what was happening, and Kevin's strong presence showed that he was in a difficult place. "The older man was behaving strangely," Jeffrey finally said, trying to explain what he had done. "I was just doing my job. When he started shouting, I ran out of patience and held him back. That was all." Kevin, hearing Jeffrey's feeble attempt to downplay what had happened, stepped forward and interrupted. "It wasn't just that," said Kevin, looking right at Jeffrey. "You pushed him, made him fall and put the handcuffs on him for no reason. When I arrived, you wouldn't listen to me. If I hadn't helped, who knows what else you would have done." The people around spoke quietly, agreeing with each other. The sound of the witnesses' voices seemed to make Jeffrey's situation even heavier. Matthew looked around and realized that the situation had become more serious than he had thought. It wasn't just an error in thinking, but a clear breach of rights. Many witnesses saw it happen. The colonel let out a heavy sigh. He understood that as the leader of the police station, he needed to act fairly. That might mean having to punish one of his own officers. He turned to Jeffrey again, but this time his gaze was stronger and more serious. "Jeffrey," said Matthew in a firm voice, "what you did was more than a mistake. It was a misuse of power. Not only did you do something you weren't sure about, but you used your strength to shame an innocent man. That can't be accepted." Jeffrey tried to speak, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. He realized that he had gone too far. Now, with the rigid gaze of his boss, he saw the truth about his situation. He lowered his head. His pride was hurt, and he felt ashamed. Matthew turned to Kevin and became calmer. "Lieutenant James," he said, "I apologize to the police station for what happened to your father. We'll deal with it in the right way. Jeffrey will be taken to the police station and kept away from his work while we investigate everything." Kevin nodded slightly. He could see that the colonel was trying to fix the situation. He understood that, at that moment, justice was happening, even if it was a little late. A sense of relief began to creep into his anger, but there was still a strong sadness at what his father had been through. As Jeffrey's colleagues put him in the car with his hands tied, the people around him slowly left. They were still talking quietly about what had happened. Kevin walked over to his father, who was now receiving help from some of the people passing by. James, even though he felt tired, looked at his son with a grateful and satisfied smile. "Thank you, my son," said James, his voice low but full of feeling. Kevin took his father's hand and leaned over to help him up. "I'll be here for you, Dad," said Kevin with certainty in his voice. Inside the car, a strong mixture of emotions was taking place. It was intense and difficult to control. Jeffrey was sitting with his hands clasped. He didn't feel the respite that the park seemed to bring. On the other hand, hatred and anger occupied every part of his body. Jeffrey was very sad, but not in the way people think. He felt no remorse. He didn't think about what he had done. He didn't even have a hint of regret for what he had done to James. Instead, his head was full of thoughts about the shame he had just experienced in front of other people. The image of Kevin taking control of the situation and dominating him in front of everyone stuck in his head like poison. He, a policeman who was used to having power and being in charge, had been arrested and put in handcuffs like a thug. Every time Jeffrey thought of the people who saw him being taken away in the park, he felt his shame turn to strong anger. Sitting in the back of the police car, Jeffrey looked at his handcuffed hands. He felt powerless and began to feel angry with himself and all the people who were in this situation. He closed his mouth tightly, trying to hold back his emotions. But the truth was that his head was full of only one thing: revenge. Why did this happen to me? The question kept popping into Jeffrey's head. He, who had always been strict when it came to controlling his area, was now like this. He began to think about the events in his head. He didn't want to find mistakes that he had made. He wanted to hold other people responsible. Kevin, with his soldierly manner, had made him feel ashamed. James, by not agreeing to submit, had caused the whole mess. Colonel Matthew, who was supposed to be with him, decided to let him go without trying to defend him. Resentment grew inside him like a dark shadow. Jeffrey felt that everyone had been disloyal to him. Your friends saw you fall and did nothing. The colonel showed no support either. The greatest hatred was for Kevin and James. They were the cause of all that suffering. Kevin defied his authority. He humiliated him physically and also in front of other people. And James, that gentleman he hadn't appreciated, became the cause of it all. Jeffrey turned his head away and closed his eyes. He was trying to control his breathing. The anger kept building. It grew stronger and stronger. He knew that his job was under threat. He understood that he could lose his badge and his job. But what occupied his mind most was the desire to take revenge. He couldn't let it end like this, with him being the only one to be punished. At that moment, still trapped and thinking about what to do, he had an idea. A bad idea, which came from anger and the desire to take revenge. He understood that if he wanted to beat those who had shamed him, he had to be careful. He couldn't spend what he had already lost. Every move had to be calculated. Every step had to be carefully planned. He wanted to take revenge on Kevin, on James, and thus on everyone who had made him look weak. They'll pay for this, Jeffrey told himself. He felt the hatred rise up in his body like poison. Everyone. At first, the idea of taking revenge was easy, but as he thought about the details, it all started to make sense. Jeffrey understood that he couldn't just do things without thinking. Kevin was an army officer. Facing him head-on would be a chance to lose. James, even though he was old, had emotional control over Kevin. If Jeffrey wanted to hurt Kevin, he knew he had to deal with James first. But it wouldn't be enough just to reach them. Jeffrey wanted to finish them off, piece by piece. He thought that when his revenge was over, they would have nothing left. No dignity, no honor. He decided that the first step would be to make Colonel Matthew feel ashamed. Matthew was the person who had left him at the worst time, allowing him to be suspended without question. Jeffrey knew Matthew's faults. He knew about Matthew's life and his weaknesses. To end Matthew's career, he would need an outsider. That person would have to set a discreet trap. It was at that moment that Stephanie popped into his head. She was an easily influenced young woman he knew. She was the perfect person for what he planned to do. Stephanie was a young woman who knew how fragile people in charge can be. Jeffrey believed that, with the right motivation, she would be able to win Matthew over and put him in a situation of abuse scandal. All she had to do was plant the right evidence, create the illusion of an improper relationship, and then force the situation until Matthew fell apart. With Matthew's reputation ruined, Jeffrey would feel the bad taste of his revenge begin to set in. But that was only the beginning. Kevin and James were still the main targets of his anger. Jeffrey began to think about the next part of his plan. This part would be more personal and very impactful. He remembered how much Kevin valued his father. Family was everything to Kevin. To hurt Kevin where it hurt most, Jeffrey knew he would have to take something away from him that couldn't be recovered. James began to think about the kidnapping. He would make Kevin suffer a lot, not just with money, but also with feelings. Putting Kevin through pain and fear for his father's life would be the ultimate revenge. As the car drove through the streets towards the police station, Jeffrey, whose hands were still tied, thought about sad things. Hatred became a driving force, and revenge became the only thing that mattered. He knew he had to be calm and smart, but he was determined to make everyone pay for what they had done to him. The car stopped in front of the police station. The officers opened the door to get Jeffrey out of the vehicle. He got out with the handcuffs still on his wrists. He had a sad and firm expression on his face. He understood that the situation had changed. Now he would be responsible for a severe revenge plan. In the back of his mind, the voice of anger kept saying, "They'll regret it. All of them." Jeffrey's hatred, which was now very strong, began to turn into a dark story of revenge. For him, it wasn't enough just to take revenge. He wanted to finish off every single person who had brought him shame. The first step in his plan would be to take down Colonel Matthew. He believed that this man had betrayed him by not defending him to Kevin and James. Jeffrey couldn't forget how Matthew had left him in an ugly way. He had handed him over to a system that was supposed to help him. Now he would think about revenge carefully and slowly. In the weeks after he was suspended, Jeffrey began to work in silence. He did so carefully as he put together his story. He knew that to destroy Colonel Matthew's image, it wouldn't be enough to make a simple accusation. He needed to set up a situation that was very careful and so difficult that it gave the police chief no chance to defend himself. And so he began to organize the first part of his plan. Jeffrey knew where Matthew had difficulties. Did you know that the colonel, even though he was a serious man with values, had his weaknesses? One of these was his willingness to be carried away by beautiful young men. Even though he appeared to be a good and respectable man to others, Jeffrey knew that in his personal life, Matthew couldn't resist temptation. It was at this point that Stephanie appeared in the story. Stephanie was 20 years old. She had red hair and was very pretty. Her beauty attracted everyone's attention. She was intelligent, had a desire to grow, and knew how to use her skills to get what she wanted. Jeffrey had known Stephanie for some time. He knew about her dreams and how she could play with people's feelings. She was the ideal person for the trap he was about to set. With a well-thought-out plan, Jeffrey began to get close to Stephanie. He spoke to her secretly and made her an offer. Although it was the wrong thing to do, it offered a good payment. Stephanie, who was always looking for ways to improve her life, quickly accepted. She understood that she was starting a risky situation. However, the money and the chance to control a powerful person like Matthew were too attractive to say no to. The first part of the plan was to get Stephanie to slowly approach Colonel Matthew. She would go to the same places as him. They went to bars, community events, and even more serious meetings where people like Matthew used to be. She began to show herself as a young woman who cared about social justice. She liked people who had power, like Matthew. This affected the colonel's pride. He had a serious manner, but he liked the attention he got from young women. Over time, Stephanie grew closer to Matthew's life. He didn't realize what her true intentions were behind her interest. Matthew, facing a difficult time because of Jeffrey's situation and the tensions at the police station, began to talk to Stephanie. She had a discreet but attractive demeanor. She knew how to make Matthew feel special, important, as if he was the only one who understood his worries and ambitions. Stephanie was a manipulator, and the colonel, without noticing, began to get carried away by her presence. Their relationship progressed quickly. Matthew kept up appearances but began meeting Stephanie in private. They exchanged messages that initially seemed innocent, but became more intimate over time. Jeffrey's trap worked well. After a few weeks, Jeffrey made his move. He directed Stephanie to subtly pressure Matthew to meet outside of public places. Matthew, worried about his reputation, resisted at first, but Stephanie's desire and ability to manipulate his emotions made him give in. Jeffrey began the second part of his plan to meet discreetly. Jeffrey knew he needed hard evidence to bring Matthew down. He provided detailed documentation of each meeting. He recorded their conversations and encounters with Stephanie's help, capturing compromising moments that revealed Matthew in an inappropriate relationship. After a month of meetings and recordings, Jeffrey was ready for the decisive blow. He advised Stephanie to report Matthew for harassment and abuse. Stephanie went to the police station with falsified evidence, edited messages and recordings that showed Matthew in delicate situations. She claimed that Matthew abused his position of authority to manipulate her emotionally, forcing her into an unwanted relationship. The complaint surprised the police station. Colonel Matthew, previously respected, was placed under investigation. The evidence was damning, and the local media quickly broke the story. Jeffrey, from afar, felt the bitter taste of victory coming on. Matthew's reputation was ruined. The accusation had a devastating impact on the colonel. He was removed, demoted to lieutenant, and suspended for a year during the investigations. Once admired, Matthew was now viewed with suspicion, and his once respected name was tarnished by a scandal with concrete evidence. Matthew defended himself at the hearing. He said it was all a misunderstanding, manipulated, and that Stephanie had lied. The avalanche of evidence was hurting him. The messages and recordings suggested that he had been inappropriately involved with the young woman. The narrative of Stephanie, a young and vulnerable woman, and the records presented were enough to convict him, even without physical evidence of coercion. His superiors, under pressure to react quickly to protect the reputation of the police, decided to act harshly. The image of the police was compromised, and they could not allow a man in such a high position to go unpunished. The decision was clear. Matthew was demoted from colonel to lieutenant and suspended for a year during the investigation. News of his suspension and demotion spread quickly through the city, driven by the tabloids and gossip. The man who had spent years serving on the police force was now in the middle of scandals, his career ruined. What consumed him most was that, to everyone, he looked guilty. The stares at the police station and the whispers in the street were pain for his soul. He, who had arrested criminals and administered justice, was now a defendant with no way of proving his innocence. The initial days after his fall were the worst. News of his demotion and suspension spread quickly, and Matthew saw his circle of trust crumble. Friends and colleagues he saw as loyal began to distance themselves. Some, for fear of association with the scandal, avoided linking their names to it. Others no longer knew what to think. Trust in Matthew was shaken by the proven evidence presented. He would become a pariah in the very institution he had proudly commanded. Stephanie played the victim with great skill. In interviews, she saw herself as a young woman manipulated by a powerful man as she sought guidance. Her comments were measured, and journalists devoured the story like vultures on prey. Stephanie would comment on how she felt trapped as Matthew used his power to lure her into an unwanted situation. The audience, in search of a villain, quickly accepted this version of the story. Matthew, alone and distressed, locked himself in his house. He hardly looked in the mirror as he saw the image of a broken man. Shame and humiliation overwhelmed him. Every missed call and ignored message from old friends reminded him that his world was falling apart. His family also distanced themselves. His wife, devastated, left home with the children. Matthew was alone. He was alone, immersed in despair and self-pity. Matthew's name, once linked to authority, was now compromised. He will become the town villain within weeks, and there's no reversing that. The scandal was in the headlines, in people's conversations, and even in the minds of his former subordinates. Jeffrey, from a distance, was pleased to see his plan work. Matthew's downfall was the beginning of Jeffrey's revenge, as he now saw the way clear for the second part of his plan, even more cruel and personal after demoting and destroying the colonel. Matthew couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. He went over the details with Stephanie in his mind, looking for a point that could have changed the tragedy. He had been manipulated from the start, trapped in a plot so elaborate that, even if he tried, he would never be able to prove his innocence. He felt powerless. Jeffrey, content with the success of the first stage of his plan, watched Matthew's downfall from afar. The colonel's humiliation marked the beginning of his revenge. With Matthew gone, Jeffrey could move on to the cruel and personal second part of his plan. He still needed to settle matters with Kevin and James, and Matthew's fall was only the beginning of what was to come. Jeffrey wasn't satisfied, even with the humiliation of the suspension and Matthew's fall. Revenge against the colonel was only the beginning. The pain he really wanted to cause was for Kevin and James. Jeffrey saw in Kevin not only a rival, but the man who had publicly defeated him and humiliated him in front of his colleagues in the city. For Jeffrey, Kevin was the cause of his downfall, and the only way to destroy him was to hit his weak point, his father, James. The second part of Jeffrey's plan, planned while he was suspended, consisted of a direct, more cruel and devastating action: kidnapping James. Jeffrey knew that Kevin's love for his father was strong, and in order to hurt him, he would need to tap into his deepest fears: the loss and suffering of his father. Jeffrey activated the plan with the help of criminal contacts he had made over the years. He knew he had to be precise, discreet, and severe. To kidnap James, it was necessary to monitor his movements, to find the moment when he was vulnerable and away from Kevin's protection. The next few weeks were all about monitoring. Jeffrey watched James carefully, analyzing his daily habits and walks, as if nothing could go wrong. It was late when Jeffrey decided to act. The sun was already descending, coloring the sky orange and pink, as James walked slowly towards the park, seeking the tranquility of the trees and the fresh air. He still walked with his cane, the weight of age visible in every step. The routine, which seemed harmless, was what Jeffrey needed for his revenge. He planned every detail of the kidnapping, waiting for the perfect moment. When James reached the most remote area of the park, Jeffrey reacted. James was surrounded by two accomplices who got out of a nearby van. It happened in an instant. Jeffrey, hidden, watched as the accomplices approached quickly, with no chance of shouting or resisting. The frail old man tried to struggle, but his strength was weak in the face of two younger men. Within seconds, he was pushed into the van, leaving his walking stick on the ground. The park, which had been a refuge for James, now became his nightmare. In a few minutes, he was gone, taken away in silence without anyone noticing. The van doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped away, leaving silence and a cold wind as witnesses to the crime. In the van, James was confused, his heart racing as he tried to understand what had happened. His eyes, still surprised, met the icy gaze of Jeffrey, who was now sitting next to him. Jeffrey's angry, vengeful face was the one James had least expected. His lips turned into a cruel smile. "I warned you that you would pay for this," said Jeffrey, his voice low and full of hatred. "Now your son will suffer the consequences too." James tried to speak but couldn't. He could see the danger, but the reality of what was happening was beginning to clarify itself in his mind. Jeffrey, immersed in his hatred, showed no compassion. For him, this was only the beginning of Kevin's total destruction. Hours later, Kevin received a phone call that changed everything. His voice faltered as he heard the strange sound on the other end of the line. Jeffrey coldly told Kevin about his father's kidnapping. He detailed what had happened and cruelly revealed the price of James's freedom: $2 million. Kevin needed to raise the money quickly, and calling the police would have deadly consequences for his father. "If I notice the presence of the police, Kevin, your father will bear the consequences," Jeffrey threatened. "Trust me, no one will find him in time." "He's too old to withstand this stress, don't you think?" Kevin, stunned and desperate, could hardly breathe. His father's kidnapping had struck him like a blow, leaving him paralyzed. He knew that his father's life was at risk, and the helplessness of not being able to count on the authorities distressed him. Time was against him, and the fear of losing his father became unbearable. Over the next few days, Kevin faced severe emotional torment. The weight of saving his father distressed him at every turn. He pooled his savings, sold assets, and sought loans. Kevin found it impossible to raise $2 million in a short space of time, but he was determined to do what was necessary to save his father. James was captive in an unknown and cold place. Jeffrey, cold and systematic, didn't ease the old man's suffering. James was weakened, his health affected by age and the strain of being under the control of a vengeful man. Every day, James felt his strength diminishing, and the uncertainty of his fate weighed on him like a dark cloud. Kevin had to hide his real fear from everyone around him. He knew that any weakness could be used against him. He didn't want his family to know how desperate the situation was. Inside, he was tearing himself apart. Every unresolved second brought him closer to a tragedy he didn't know if he could bear. After exhausting his options, Kevin got the money. He did the impossible. He raised the money by taking out large loans and selling all his possessions. The reserves accumulated during his career were exhausted in days. Kevin was financially ruined, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was his father's safety. With the money together, Kevin transferred it following Jeffrey's instructions, his heart racing with every step. His hands trembled as he clicked the button to transfer the money, aware that, despite the payment, there were no guarantees. Jeffrey was fickle and cruel. He doubted that the money would buy his father's freedom, but he had no choice. It was his only chance. Kevin felt an emptiness as he transferred. Uncertainty and fear still controlled his mind. He thought of James, exhausted and vulnerable, suffering in an unknown place, surrounded by men who saw him only as a commodity. Kevin was devastated. Even with the ransom paid, he knew that the emotional and physical scars on his father would be deep if James were still alive. A few days later, the news came through. James had been released. Kevin felt relief, but worry soon followed. He rushed to meet him, but when he saw him, he realized how much his father had been affected. James was weak and haggard. The kidnapping had drained the little vigor from his body. The marks of captivity were clear in his eyes and face. Kevin recognized that, although James was free, the damage had already been done. When he reached the place where James was, Kevin ran to meet his father. James was on the ground, leaning against a tree, panting and with a tired face. The man, who had always had dignity, now looked destroyed, as if his last strength had been taken away. His eyes, once vibrant and wise, were clouded by trauma. As Kevin knelt down beside him, he felt a great squeeze in his heart. "Dad, I'm here." "You're safe now," said Kevin, his voice breaking, holding back tears. James raised his eyes slowly, as if it were difficult to look at his son. He tried to smile, but the exhaustion was too strong to allow any relief. "I knew you'd come," James said in a weak voice. Kevin took his father's hand, noticing that it was cold and slightly shaking. The touch between them, once strength and affection, now felt like pain and guilt. Kevin felt James's suffering as a burden. The paramedics soon arrived to give James first aid. They put him on a stretcher and checked his vital signs, but Kevin realized, when he saw his father's face, that something had changed forever. Although James's body was still there, something in it seemed broken, like a flame that was slowly dying out. As the ambulance took James to hospital, Kevin sat in the passenger seat, caught up in confused thoughts. The image of Jeffrey, smiling cruelly, overwhelmed him. The ransom had been paid, but the real cost was far greater. Jeffrey knew that kidnapping James was about more than money. It was a way of causing Kevin emotional pain for having defied him before. James was taken to the hospital emergency room where doctors carried out tests. Kevin was on the outside, unable to move or speak, trapped in emotional shock. Every minute seemed to last. The machines monitoring James's vital signs made continuous noises, increasing Kevin's anxiety. Doctors mentioned severe dehydration, high stress, and health impaired by age. When he went in to see his father, Kevin realized that the situation was more serious than he had thought. James was in bed, with tubes and wires attached to his body, his face pale and his eyes closed. Kevin walked slowly, feeling that every step towards the bed was a plunge into sadness. "Dad," Kevin said as he sat down on the side of the bed and held James's hand gently. The touch was gentle but sure, a gesture he hoped would bring comfort to the man he loved. James opened his eyes slowly, with difficulty. His gaze was distant, as if he were trying to stay here. He stared at Kevin, and for a moment his old strength seemed to return. His lips spoke softly. "You did your best, Kevin." "I knew you'd find me," said James, his voice weakened by pain and exhaustion. "It devastated me." The words hit Kevin like an icy blade. The man, once an example of strength, now accepted his fragility. The kidnapping and the emotional suffering drained his energy. Kevin, prepared for anything in his military career, now felt powerless as he realized that his father was on the verge of collapse. James remained in hospital trying to recover. The emotional trauma and stress of the kidnapping were too much for his weakened body. Kevin stayed at his father's bedside every night, holding his hand, waiting for a miracle that he knew wouldn't happen. Soon, the inevitable happened. James, overwhelmed by the pressure, had a heart attack. Kevin was by his father's side when the doctors tried to revive him. He watched, immobilized, as the medical team did their best to resuscitate his father. But deep down, he knew it was too late. When the doctors stopped, confirming Kevin's fear, the silence that followed was intense. James was gone. The man who had been his support and teacher, who had taught him about honor and resilience, was now dead. Kevin, standing next to his father's body, felt a wave of emotions. He wept not only for the loss, but for the intense helplessness. He had done everything to save his father, but in the end, Jeffrey's cruelty had prevailed. The pain was unbearable, and he knew he would never forgive Jeffrey. At James's funeral, Kevin was silent, his face marked by pain and anger. He knew the chapter was over, but his struggle continued. Jeffrey had caused an eternal wound, and Kevin vowed silently at his father's grave that justice would not be the only solution. Revenge, cold and planned, would be the only way to face the pain that consumed his soul. James had died in her arms in hospital a few days earlier. The heart attack that ended his life was the tragic result of a heart that had endured too much pain, not just a tired body. The kidnapping, fear, and isolation had destroyed James internally. The man, always strong and dignified, couldn't stand Jeffrey's cruelty. Kevin knelt beside the grave, the cold earth on his knees. The moonlight illuminated his father's name on the stone, a sign that James would not return. Kevin touched the name, his fingers trembling slightly. In the total silence around him, he made his promise. "I promise, Dad," said Kevin, his voice low. "I promise I won't stop until Jeffrey pays for this. I'll make sure he feels the same pain and despair that you did, no matter how long it takes or what I have to do. He won't get away with it." The words came out of his mouth alarmingly. It wasn't an impulsive promise made out of weakness or lack of control. It was a clear decision, a war he was declaring to himself and to the world. Kevin knew that his life would be marked by this promise. Kevin could only move forward by ensuring that Jeffrey's life was ruined in the same way that he had everything taken away from him. Kevin's mind, shaped by military discipline, began to work out his plan. He didn't just want Jeffrey to be locked up. No, that would be too easy a punishment. Jeffrey wanted to experience the same terror and helplessness that he had caused James. Kevin wanted to see him disintegrate like his father, and his revenge would be total, emotional, psychological, and physical. Kneeling down, Kevin closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He remembered everything he had learned in the army, how patience and precision were strong weapons. He knew he couldn't rush. Every action against Jeffrey had to be carefully planned. There was no margin for failure. Jeffrey was cunning, and one mistake could help him take his revenge. Kevin stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the promise he had made. He stared at his father's grave one last time before walking away, certain that he would not return until he had accomplished his mission. He had already faced many challenges, both in the war and in his personal life, but this would be the most important. He wasn't fighting for a medal, a promotion, or a national cause. He was fighting for justice, his honor, and his father's legacy. In the days that followed, Kevin dedicated himself to revenge like never before. His military connections and old battle buddies would come in handy. He began planning every detail and move to ensure Jeffrey's downfall in his personal life and in all areas. Kevin wanted to see Jeffrey ruined, his freedom, reputation, and mental stability. Nothing. Jeffrey was still free, thinking that his revenge was complete with James's death. He was unaware that somewhere in the city, Kevin was planning an extremely cruel response. Jeffrey's plan to kidnap and extort partly worked, but he underestimated Kevin. Jeffrey was wrong to think that James's death was the end of the story. Kevin knew that what he was about to do would require more than strength or military skills. He needed cunning, patience, and above all, calm in the midst of chaos. He had to be a shadow, acting in the shadows until it was time to strike. With the promise to his father's grave in mind, Kevin began his journey. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was determined. Kevin was ready to take revenge on Jeffrey, slowly and ruthlessly. Justice would come, but revenge would be tastier. The hunt began carefully. Kevin knew that Jeffrey wasn't stupid enough to stay in town. After James's kidnapping and death, Jeffrey had gone into hiding, aware that Kevin would be looking for him. Kevin called on his old military contacts. He worked with men and women who are now in positions of influence in various fields, such as intelligence, the police, and private security. Each connection was an essential link in the web that Kevin wove. As Kevin expanded his network of information, he began to create a profile of the places where Jeffrey might be hiding. He examined Jeffrey's recent movements, his behavior, and possible contacts in crime. Jeffrey wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was involved in schemes beyond most people's knowledge. Kevin knew that the key to finding him was to trace his contacts and connections. The search took weeks. Kevin spent hours at the computer, analyzing data, receiving reports from informants, and tracking suspicious bank transactions. Every detail was important. An anonymous transfer to a tax haven, the rental of a remote house under a false name, and the movements of Jeffrey's acquaintances who had also disappeared from the city. Everything pointed to something bigger, beyond the reach of the local police. Jeffrey was no longer hiding in an obvious place. He had gone to a more remote and isolated location. Kevin found the clue that would lead him to the truth. A traced transaction led to an isolated island in the Caribbean, where small illegal fortunes were laundered without attracting attention. Jeffrey, with the money extorted from Kevin, seemed to have settled in an isolated village, surrounded by deserted beaches and rainforests, where the law did not easily enter. For Jeffrey, the place was a paradise, isolated and untouched, where he believed he would never be discovered. Jeffrey underestimated Kevin's determination. Upon confirming where Jeffrey was, Kevin felt both relief and anger. The hunt he had started was almost over, but he knew that the most complicated part was yet to come. Going to that island meant more than capturing Jeffrey. It meant entering hostile territory where he might have allies and would be ready to defend himself. Kevin, however, was ready for anything. He launched a secret operation, beyond the reach of the normal authorities. He called in his army subordinates, whom he trusted completely. These men had served with Kevin on risky missions and knew that, when he called, it was for a just cause. They were ready to follow Kevin anywhere, no questions asked. The operation was carried out with military precision. Kevin and his team analyzed the island, located the entrances and exits, the vulnerable areas, and Jeffrey's potential hiding places. Every detail was carefully analyzed. They knew they couldn't fail. Jeffrey, cunning, expected retaliation, and one false step could result in the mission failing. The plan consisted of an agile and discreet approach. They would use a ship to reach the island without being seen and infiltrate the forest to the village where Jeffrey was. Kevin wanted to avoid excessive attention and for the operation to be publicized before the time was right. Jeffrey needed to be arrested before he escaped again. The trip to the island was tense. Kevin, surrounded by his trusted men, felt the weight of his mission on his entire body. The ship sailed silently through the dark Caribbean waters at night. When they reached the island, the silence was broken only by the sound of the waves on the beach. Kevin and his men disembarked quickly, with the precision and silence of a trained military unit. They made their way through the forest, following the paths that had already been defined. Every step was planned, every move calculated. They knew there was no margin for error. The village where Jeffrey was hiding was small, with wooden houses and a dirt track that led down to the beach. Kevin, surrounded by his men, moved forward with watchful eyes. Kevin was determined to find Jeffrey, who was somewhere. After hours of infiltration, they arrived at Jeffrey's rented house. It was a simple cottage, but with luxuries that revealed the illicit money that kept it afloat. Kevin paused to take a deep breath. He knew that Jeffrey was behind the door. The moment he had been waiting for was about to happen. His plan had led him here, and now it would all come down to this final confrontation. Kevin silently signaled for his men to surround the house. Footsteps faded into the darkness as they positioned themselves on the property, ready for any situation. Kevin approached the front door. His heart was pounding, but his training and discipline kept his mind clear and focused. Kevin kicked the door, which opened with a bang. He entered the cabin looking around for Jeffrey. In the corner of the room, he spotted him. "It's over, Jeffrey," said Kevin, his voice deep and calm. Kevin's gaze was cold and intense, making it clear what was coming next. Jeffrey, who had always thought he was in control, was now in Kevin's hands. Every attempt at resistance was thwarted with the precision of a man who had waited a long time for this moment. Jeffrey tried to speak, possibly to justify himself or ask for his life, but Kevin wouldn't listen. Words lost their meaning. Jeffrey used his words to deceive and manipulate. It was time to act, without speeches or excuses. Kevin took him to the center of the room while his men, like shadows, made sure Jeffrey didn't run away. The room had little light, with a dim bulb swinging from the ceiling. The shadows on the walls created a theatrical atmosphere, as if Jeffrey's fate was being decided on that stage. Kevin knocked Jeffrey down, forcing him to his knees. Jeffrey's gaze, once malicious and arrogant, was now filled with terror. He knew that his life was in Kevin's hands. "Do you think you can just get away with anything?" Kevin said, his voice low and full of restrained fury. He moved closer to Jeffrey, staring at the man who had caused him so much suffering. "Do you believe that you can ruin lives and disappear, as if nothing had happened? You caused my father suffering, leading him to an undignified death." Did you think you'd get away with it? Jeffrey tried to speak, but Kevin silenced him with a look. There was nothing more to be said. Jeffrey was facing his executioner with no escape from the consequences of his actions. Kevin removed the handcuffs from his waist, a pair he kept as a bitter reminder of the day Jeffrey handcuffed his father and humiliated him. Kevin bent down in front of Jeffrey, his gaze impassive. "You're under arrest, Jeffrey," said Kevin with authority. He quickly handcuffed Jeffrey's wrists, feeling the satisfaction of finally seeing him under control. Jeffrey, frightened, tried to break free, but Kevin held him back. The day of Jeffrey's trial arrived in earnest. Demonstrators gathered in large numbers outside. They held placards demanding justice for James, Kevin, and other victims of Jeffrey's corruption and abuse of power. Shouts of justice echoed in the streets along with the buzz of the anxious crowd. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The air seemed heavier, charged with expectation. Jeffrey stood next to his lawyer, his hands cuffed in his lap and his face tired, without its usual glow of arrogance. Now he was just a shadow of the man who had once used his badge to commit cruelties. He stared at the floor, aware that there was no escape. The judge entered the room and the sound of the gavel silenced the crowd's complaints. The trial would begin. The prosecution made a compelling presentation of Jeffrey's crimes. It was a clear case with solid evidence, irrefutable testimony, and a history of abuse of power that, for years, had been ignored by the flaws in the system. The details of James's kidnapping, the extortion, and the abuse of Jeffrey were revealed in an alarming way. The prosecution presented a negative image of the defendant, revealing how he used his power to oppress, extort, and destroy lives. Every word was a blade, destroying Jeffrey's dignity. He didn't dare look at Kevin, who stood impassively in the room, watching every move and testimony. For Kevin, the trial marked the end of a long journey. He had faced weeks of pain and suffering, but now he was there, seeing the outcome of what he had promised at his father's grave. The defense argued that Jeffrey acted under pressure, with crimes resulting from a disturbed mind and years of service that affected his judgment. No one was willing to accept an apology. Jeffrey was not a victim. He used his power intentionally and cruelly to achieve his goals, and the consequences of his actions were visible to all. Kevin was called to testify. As he took the witness stand, he felt the weight of the audience's expectations. He understood that his words had symbolic power. He symbolized justice not only for his father, but for all those who had suffered at the hands of men like Jeffrey, who abused authority to oppress. He stared at Jeffrey as he began to speak. His strong voice resonated in the courtroom. My father, James, was a dignified man who lived honorably. He faced many difficulties in life, but he was never treated as cruelly as in his last days. Jeffrey not only stole my father's life, but also destroyed his soul and hope. James died because of the fear and emotional torture imposed by Jeffrey. Kevin's words conveyed an intense but restrained emotion. He didn't shout, he didn't show anger, but every word was an accusation heavier than a condemnation. He recounted his father's suffering after the kidnapping, how captivity and Jeffrey's psychological brutality gradually destroyed him. Kevin commented on the emptiness in his life and the pain of losing James, who was with him every day. When Kevin finished, the silence in the courtroom was total. The pain and anger in his words marked everyone there. Even the people who were strongest because of life, like the police officers, the lawyers, and the journalists who had seen it all, felt the effect of Kevin's words. He left the place where he spoke as a witness with the same dignity he always had. He knew that what he had said was the last important part so that Jeffrey would never hurt another person again. The trial continued, but the ending was already obvious. Jeffrey thought he would never be caught for his crimes, but now he was face to face with his fate. There was no escape. The judge, after hearing all the accounts and looking at the evidence, organized himself to announce the final decision. When the result was announced, Jeffrey was found guilty of all the crimes. He had committed kidnapping, extortion, abuse of power, and indirect murder. The decision was harsh: 45 years in prison, with no chance of early release. It was a punishment that showed not only the seriousness of the things Jeffrey had done, but also the great harm his actions had caused to many people. Kevin, when he heard the decision, showed no emotion at the time. He stayed quiet, watching as Jeffrey left the room, bound, with his head bowed. The man who had once seemed invulnerable was now just a prisoner. He was a criminal who would pay for his mistakes until the end of his life. As Kevin left the courtroom, he was welcomed by the demonstrators outside. People applauded him. They weren't just cheering for his victory in court. They were also applauding him for his courage in standing up to the man who had destroyed his family. Kevin, however, wasn't there to receive applause. He knew that even with justice done, the emptiness inside him still remained. Revenge wouldn't bring James back. The sadness at the loss of his father would never go away.